believe this is the most important global connectedness report that we have issued in the 15 years since we began this series. With military conflicts escalating and U.S. tariffs at the highest levels in decades, there's a widespread view in many quarters that globalization is going into reverse. Our report strongly challenges that perspective based on an analysis of more than 9 million data points on country-to-country flows of trade, capital, information, and people. So I'll focus most of my presentation on this big question: has globalization gone into reverse? And then at the end of the presentation, I'll reveal our latest ranking of the world's most globally connected countries, and then I'll share some highlights about Vietnam, since we're launching this year's report here in Hanoi. We analyzed the possibility of a reversal of globalization by considering three ways that could potentially happen. One would be via a shift from international to domestic activity. Another is via a fracturing or fragmentation of the world economy between geopolitical rivals. And the third would be via a turn from globalization to regionalization. Let's start with the possibility of a turn from international to domestic activity. Our analysis of the depth of globalization measures this based on 14 types of international flows across the four categories of trade flows, capital flows, information flows, and people flows. If these trends go down, that means we really are seeing a shift from international to domestic activity. On the other hand, if we see these trends go up, that would mean globalization is advancing and more of the world's activity is happening across national borders. Here's the trend for trade. The share of the world's output that's traded internationally remains close to its all-time high, and the latest data indicate that it increased slightly in 2025. An increase in trade intensity is probably pretty surprising for many of us, because trade was the aspect of globalization that faced the biggest shocks in 2025. So I'll comment a little bit more on trade than I do on the other aspects of globalization. Despite U.S. tariff increases, the global volume of trade in goods actually grew faster in 2025 than in any other year since 2017, if you exclude the rebound after trade plummeted during the COVID pandemic. One of the main drivers of trade growth in 2025 was the race to build out AI infrastructure. According to WTO estimates, 42% of the growth in global goods trade over the first 3 quarters of 2025 was driven by AI-related products. And looking forward, while tariff increases are expected to slow global trade growth, over the 26 to 29 period, global trade volumes are still expected to grow at the same annualized rate as they grew over the past decade. I think that's pretty remarkable. Despite all the challenges that we've seen, global trade growth was unusually strong last year, and we're forecasting to continue to see a very typical rate of trade growth moving forward. Moving on to capital flows, this is the most volatile part of the index. It reached a new peak in 2024. The latest data indicate a small decrease in 2025. The main reason for that was a weakening of greenfield foreign direct investment in the 2025 data. Information flows have seen the biggest globalization gains over the past quarter century, to a level that's much higher than the globalization level of capital or trade flows. However, we do see a recent slowdown in the globalization of information flows. People flows, on the other hand, are much less globalized. The people flows are way at the bottom of the slide. People flows were also hit hardest by the COVID pandemic, but they've now fully recovered, and we're back to a record high level for people flows. So when we combine the trade, capital, information, and people flow data into our overall globalization depth trend, what we see is that it's holding steady. It's been basically stable ever since it last hit a new record high in 2022. The share of global activity that happens across national borders hasn't been rising the last few years, but it hasn't been going down either. And beyond its stability, the absolute level of this measurement is also important. The latest reading is 25% on a scale that runs from 0%, which would mean no flows cross national borders at all, to 100%, which would mean that borders and distance have ceased to matter, and interactions are just as likely to happen between countries as they are within countries. The current level of 25% actually means that we're still closer to a world of completely separate countries than we are to a fully globalized world. And that means there's actually a great deal of room for international flows to keep growing if we don't have new policy constraints. Before I finish this topic, since everything I've showed you so far is at a pretty macro level, I'd like to highlight two key measures of the globalization of business. First, sales. Publicly traded companies, on average, continue to earn close to the highest recorded shares of their sales in foreign markets, and companies continue to invest abroad as well. The share of mergers and acquisitions transactions that take place between companies in different countries continues to hold steady. So on the question of a shift from international to domestic activity, the answer is an unequivocal no. The share of activity happening across borders continues to hold steady. Let's turn then to the second way globalization could potentially go into reverse, via a fracturing or fragmentation of the world economy between geopolitical rivals. Here we're shifting our attention from how much crosses national borders to the patterns of which countries interact more or less with which other countries. And this is the aspect of the report that requires us to track more than 9 million data points, so we can track each type of flow between each pair of countries and how it develops over time. To start on this topic, let's look at how much trade patterns changed in 2025 versus how much trade patterns change in a typical year. The red bar here at the right of this chart shows how much the shares of countries' trade flows shifted across origins and destinations in 2025, and the black horizontal line you see shows the average amount of change in trade patterns in a typical year. Interestingly, while global trade patterns did change more in 2025 than they do in an average year, they actually changed less last year than they did during other recent disruptions, such as the early stages of the war in Ukraine in 2022 and 2023. So there was an above average amount of change in trade patterns last year, but it wasn't off the charts and it certainly wasn't unprecedented. U.S. trade patterns, on the other hand, did change much more dramatically in 2025. U.S. import sources changed more than twice as much as they do in an average year, and more than in any other year covered in our study. Please hold this idea in your minds. Globally, patterns of international flows continue to be remarkably stable, even as countries at the center of current conflicts and countries really that are at the center of the current policy shocks, like the United States, have bigger changes. The biggest geopolitical fault line, of course, is between the US and China, and we're continuing to see a major weakening of ties between these two economic giants. Since 2016, on average, the share of U.S. trade, capital, information, and people flows that are to or from China has fallen by 42%. And over the same period, the share of China's flows that are with the United States is down 37%. The most sensitive of those flows is the flow of goods from China to the U.S., and it is down sharply. The share of U.S. imports that comes from China peaked in 2017, before the first round of U.S.-China tariff escalation. It was already down all the way to 13% by 2024, and it fell further to only 9% in 2025. The share of U.S. imports coming from China is now all the way down to below where it was when China entered the WTO in 2001. I would, however, strongly caution against taking that result as clear evidence of a big drop in U.S. reliance on goods produced in China. The official imports data that are used to make that trend, which is seen in many different places, only include direct imports from China. They leave out all of the material and components that increasingly go into goods that are produced in other countries, the Chinese products from China, those kinds of materials and components that increasingly are used to produce goods in other countries. We could only take that kind of indirect trade into account through 2024, and the data there on that trend involves some estimation. But at least through 2024, they actually don't show a meaningful falling trend in the share of all the value consumed in the US economy that originates in China. So while there is much less direct trade between the US and China, indirect trade has maintained a substantial amount of interdependence between those two economies. Before moving on, I'd like to put the drop in US imports that comes from China into perspective in one other way. The yellow line here still shows the share of US imports that comes from China, but I've now added a blue line here that shows the share of US close allies imports that comes from China. While the US has dramatically reduced its trade ties with China, there is no similar decoupling trend if you look at the imports of US allies. This fits with that point that I asked you to keep in mind a moment ago, that countries at the center of current tensions have big changes, but there's a lot of stability around the rest of the world. We really should not presume that a US-China decoupling trend necessarily implies a split of the world economy between rival blocs of allied countries. To make that point even more strongly, let's go beyond the US and China and allies of those countries to look at a measure of the geopolitical distance traversed by all countries' trade flows. And that's measured based on how countries vote in the United Nations General Assembly. This measure of geopolitical distance would equal 0 if all trade around the world happened between the countries with the most similar geopolitical positions. So there would be no trade at all between adversaries. You could think of 0 as maximum friendshoring or fragmentation. On the other hand, 100% would be the opposite condition. You'd have 100 would be meaning that all trade is between the countries with the most different geopolitical positions. This measure did show a meaningful decline in 2022 and 2023, indicating some fracturing or fragmentation because there was less trade in those years happening between countries with different geopolitical positions. But 89% of that decline, almost 90% of that fracturing trend, was due only to the reorientation of Russia's trade flows due to sanctions imposed following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and because of weaker trade ties between the US and China. Beyond those geopolitical hotspots, there's very little evidence of a fragmentation trend along geopolitical lines. Furthermore, look at the last 2 years. Through 2024, through the first 9 months of 2025, there is no further decline on this measure. So what that tells us is that the latest data really do not support the view that there is an ongoing global pattern of countries reorienting their trade along geopolitical lines. Finally, as my last slide on geopolitically related shifts in trade patterns, I'd like to show you the changing composition of all trade around the world. Now, since we have all trade on this chart, the numbers will sum to 100%. Here's trade between the US and China. The share of all trade around the world that happens between the US and China peaked in 2015 at 3.5% of world trade. By 2024, that was down to 2.7%, and over the first 9 months of last year, it fell further to 2.0%. So those are big declines in the US-China trade lane, but we're still only looking at 1.5% of world trade there. And here's the rest of the trade that's really in the crosshairs of geopolitical conflicts, trade between US-aligned and China-aligned groups of close allies. That's down from 12.6% in 2015 to 10.2% in 2025, a decline of a little more than 2 percentage points, mainly because of the reorientation of Russia's trade flows. So summing those shifts that you've seen so far, that means that roughly 4% of world trade has shifted away from geopolitical rivals over the past decade. and it hasn't shifted to allies. So the bottom of this chart was all the trade that happens between geopolitical rivals. The top of the chart is the opposite. It's the trade that happens among close allies, among the countries with the most friendly relationships. What we can see is that far more trade happens among allies than with rivals. But that share of trade happening among the allies is actually stable rather than increasing. Instead, what we can see is that the countries that have actually been growing their shares of world trade the most are countries with more flexible or intermediate geopolitical positions, countries like India and Vietnam. That's why I like to say that we actually are seeing a pattern here in the data that is more of a de-risking than a friend-shoring. There is, at the bottom, somewhat less trade happening between geopolitical rivals, but that de-risking away from that trade hasn't moved up to the top, not pulled back into the allies. Most of it's gone to the countries with the more intermediate geopolitical positions. So, on the question of a geopolitical fracturing of the world economy, the results are mixed. There are big drops in flows between countries with especially difficult relations, like the US and China, but most of the world continues to maintain its ties with its traditional partners. The last way that I said globalization could potentially go into reverse would be a turn from globalization to regionalization, less ties happening between distant regions of the world. That is clearly not what we're seeing in the data. The share of trade happening inside geographic regions has been on a declining trend, and it fell to a new low of about 51% over the first 9 months of last year. Meanwhile, the average distance in kilometers over which countries trade has been going up. So trade flows actually traversed the longest average distance on record last year, about 5,010 kilometers. Likewise, announced greenfield foreign direct investment also spanned the longest average distance on record in 2025, with the lowest share happening inside regions. So on the question of a turn from globalization to regionalization, that clearly hasn't been happening in recent years. International business is already highly regionalized, but it hasn't become more regional in the last few years. So, to summarize this main part of my presentation, the data do not show a general pattern of globalization going into reverse. To the contrary, international flows are stable relative to domestic activity. Most countries maintain ties with their traditional partners, and most flows are happening over longer rather than shorter distances. Now, at this point, many of you are probably wondering, why is there so much talk of deglobalization when the data so consistently show global flows to be so resilient? I'd like to address that question head on. I'll do so using these 5 Ps that I came up with a couple of years ago. Patterns of international activity, which is the focus of our report, are really not the main topic that drives talk of deglobalization. Most talk of deglobalization is fueled by politics, such as when candidates who oppose globalization win elections, and by changes in public policy, like tariff increases. And it gets reinforced and amplified when companies announce plans to respond to those changes, and when analysts predict new barriers or predict declines in global flows. Those kinds of developments shed light on the risk of deglobalization, but they don't actually tell us whether the world has really become less globalized. Also, several common biases can often make that risk appear bigger than it really is. One is what I like to call big country bias. It's a mistake to treat trends for countries like the US or China as representative of what's happening around the world, because they really aren't. And strategic industry bias is very similar. We shouldn't presume that trends in industries like semiconductors, critical minerals, or AI are representative of what's happening across all of the different industries. And then there's the common pattern of negativity bias, which naturally makes us pay more attention to negative developments like new tariff increases than positive ones like new trade agreements. All in all, the risk of deglobalization is real, but so is the resilience so far of global flows. Focusing on hard data and avoiding these kinds of biases can help us to maintain a balanced perspective. Let's move on then to our latest ranking of the world's most globally connected countries. Singapore tops the list for overall globalization based on both the size and the geographic reach of its international trade, capital, information, and people flows. Singapore also has the largest international flows relative to its domestic activity. Luxembourg ranks second, followed by the Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, and Hong Kong. The United Arab Emirates came in seventh and also is the country that achieved the largest increase in global connectedness since 2001. Belgium is eighth. The UK ranks ninth, and the UK is the country with the most globally distributed pattern of international flows across countries around the world. And Denmark came in 10th. 7 of the top 10 are located in Europe, which ranks as the world's most globally connected region. Here I have the countries on the slide up through number 25. That brings in more European countries, as well as Malaysia, which came in 16th, and Australia, which was 21st. Here are the countries up to number 50. That brings in Canada, which was 26th, Thailand, 27th, Korea, 31st, Vietnam, 36th, the United States, 39th, and Japan, 46th. Among middle-income countries, the 3 most globally connected are all in this region in Southeast Asia. That's Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. India ranked 58th and Brazil 60th. China came in 81st. And here are the countries up through 125, 150, and the full set of 180 countries ranked on this edition of our report. Finally, since we're launching this edition of our report in Vietnam, I'd like to share a few key points about this country. Vietnam has achieved a remarkable increase in per capita income in parallel with its rising participation in international trade since the country began its economic reforms in 1986. That pattern has really made Vietnam something of a case study for globalization supporting economic development. Since 2001, Vietnam has achieved the world's 9th largest increase in global connectedness. As of 2024, Vietnam has the world's 6th highest ratio of goods exports to GDP, and also the 5th most globally distributed pattern of exports around the world. Vietnam also stands out for its bright trade growth prospects moving forward. Over the 2026 to 2030 period, Vietnam is forecast to achieve the world's 4th largest absolute increase in trade volume, as well as the 24th fastest trade volume growth rate, about 6%. There's much more content available in the report. We have one-page profiles of each country's international flows, and we also have a bunch of content online. There are interactive charts available online where you can customize the results by country and region, and you can also download the chart images and the data files there online. In summary, globalization has not gone into reverse. International flows are stable relative to domestic activity. Geopolitical shifts are still limited in global perspective. And there's been no shift to higher levels of regionalization. Singapore is the world's most globally connected country, and Europe the most globally connected region. Thank you very much.